I work on a deep-sea fishing boat off the west coast of the US. For years, I've seen nothing odd or terrifying beyond an occasional storm or injuries given to crewmates by rigging or our catch. I've always loved the sea and always felt safe and at peace on it. However, a few weeks ago, as we were pulling up our catch, something got tangled in our starboard net. When we managed to pull it aboard, it turned out to be an emergency distress buoy, one which had clearly spent a very long time in the water. We examined it and found a slightly faded stamp in the metal and polyurethane declaring for it to be turned in to the Navy if found. While the captain went to the wheelhouse to radio it in, I examined further, finding the radio emitter broken. That explained why it never had been picked up. I also discovered a sealed compartment on the side, inside which lay a waterproof baggie. It contained many pieces of paper on which somebody with a very shaky hand had written. What unnerved me was the fact that they seemed to have dried bloodstains on them. Against better judgment, I opened the bag and read them as we sailed back to port. When I finished, I immediately brought them to the captain, who turned pale as he read them. He jammed them back into the baggie and instructed me to place it back. The tone of his voice indicated that it was a demand, not a request. He also said that the Navy would be meeting us at the dock to collect the buoy. I did as he asked. However, before I did, I used the ship scanner to make copies. When we got back to port, we indeed were met by a large group of men who immediately swarmed our small vessel. They took the buoy and made us all sign a bunch of papers, saying that we would say nothing about what we found. All they would say was it was classified. They also said they'd financially reward us. When they left, the captain simply told us to forget about it. Since then, I've kept the copies hidden in my desk. Until now, I debated what to do and even thought about destroying them. But I figured that this needs to be shared. And here is the best place I know. I know I'll likely get in very serious trouble for this, but I'll deal with it when I cross that particular bridge. There was a single date at the top of the first page, indicating it was written in 2016. I'm transcribing the pages exactly as written, which may take a bit, seeing as how some pages are difficult to read. I'm honestly not sure what to think of it. But if there's any grain of truth to what is written, I'm not sure if I will ever step foot in the ocean again. Here's what it said. To whoever finds this message, I beg of you, do not let anyone attempt to mount a rescue operation for us. By the time you find this, I, or anyone on my team for that matter, will be long past the ability of anyone to save. I'm only writing this so somebody in the right position on the surface may have an account of the horrors that have befallen us down here, in the dark and cold void, which has become my colleagues' eternal tombs. And very soon, will become mine as well. And as a warning, to try and ward off any other scientists, military, or anyone for that matter, from attempting to recover what we had been sent down here to uncover and study. It may end up being in vain. God knows. I know all too well that us humans often fail to ignore the warnings that are subtly given to us to stay away, even when they are directly under our noses. But I must make an attempt anyways with the little time I have remaining, before they find where I have hidden myself. For the record, my name is Desmond Windows. I'm 35 years old, and I was a professor at the University of Oregon's Institute for Marine Biology. I had been teaching there for the last 8 years after graduating at the top of my class. I always had a quick thinking and tenacious mind, able to outthink and outperform even some of my teachers. Due to my accelerated performance, I ended up graduating 3 years earlier than intended, and was personally contacted by the dean himself, asking if I'd be willing to take up part-time tenure to help the small and very much overburdened staff down in Charleston. I immediately accepted the offer. I always loved being able to teach others about my passion for the ocean and all of its creatures. But I told them that I would also be out at times of the year, since I had already agreed to sign on with a large oceanic research corporation, which, for personal reasons, shall remain unnamed. Due to my years of diving experience, especially since I had been certified as an advanced open water diver, and I had also completed training and had been certified to be capable of safely operating an atmospheric diving suit, or ADS for short. About 6 weeks ago, I was contacted by a fellow scientist and an old friend of mine. David Kimball and I had met at an oceanic conservation panel about 6 years ago, though his career had taken a vastly different direction than mine had. He had been contracted by a private group that I'd never heard of before to act as a consultant and the head diver of their underwater salvage and research division. He basically supervised the lower down members of his team on locating long-forgotten shipwrecks, maintaining oil rig platforms, excavating underwater ruins, stuff of that nature. And he was allowed in return to use their diving suits and submersibles to conduct studies on deep water species of fish and cetaceans in his off time. He told me that the group had heard about my merits and expertise, not only working in deep water, but also about my secondary degrees in ancient languages, archaeology, and oceanography, and were interested in signing me on to an expedition currently underway. Apparently, while trying to map the ocean floor for wrecks, their sonar systems had detected an unusual anomaly about 4,000 feet below the surface. They passed over the anomaly a few times more, using an advanced system called side scan sonar. Basically, for those who do not know much about mapping the seafloor, it works almost exactly like the sonar systems you have in all boats, except you use a towfish, or a torpedo-shaped device trolled behind the boat, which emits conical pulses towards the seafloor across a wide area perpendicular to the path of the sensor, and in basic terms, creates an image or map of the seafloor it passes over. When the team had reviewed the map created, they were shocked to see what appeared to be ruins on the bottom across a 3-mile wide area. They had also discovered an American World War II battleship located less than half a mile from the ruins, dug sideways into the seafloor. To them, they had more or less hit the jackpot. A previously undiscovered shipwreck, which would net them a hefty financial discovery fee from the Navy, and what appeared to be sunken ruins from some ancient civilization which had once been above the waves. It's stuff people in their profession usually only dreamed about. Immediately, plans had been put in place to set down a deep ocean research station for scientists, biologists, and other assorted team members to be able to study both sides. I stopped them at that point and asked them why they would need either me or him. While both of us knew how to pilot submersibles in ROVs, our forte was in ADS suits, and the deepest one could currently go so far in was about 2,000 feet down, only halfway to the distance the sites were in. He leaned in and, in a hushed tone, explained to me that the group had, in almost absolute secrecy, with the exception of the appropriate agencies needed to certify and approve it for safety, developed an advanced version of the new exosuits that could withstand the pressures at over 5,000 feet underwater. They say they could theoretically keep you safe to 7,500 feet, he told me. But it's untested. He then proceeded to tell me that his group wanted me to lead the diving team to explore, film, catalog, and potentially bring to the surface some of the ruins to surface teams to study, while he would lead the team to work over the shipwreck. They would pay me handsomely for my time, in addition to being named as one of the hit discoverers of whatever lay down there. I would become immortal in the history books for my findings as well. The amount of zeros Kimball told me would be on my paycheck, plus the opportunity to be remembered forever, went to my head immediately. And before he could say anything else, I told him I would take their offer. Such a goddamn stupid decision. I was almost immediately afterward flown from the US to New Zealand, where I boarded the group's ship, the Oceanic Explorer, in Auckland, and spent almost a week heading to our destination, which lay about 200 miles from the Pitcairn Islands. When we arrived, we were greeted by 5 other ships clustered around one area of sea, 2 belonging to the same company, and 3 the Navy. They had rigged a platform that dangled between them, where the submersibles could arrive, dock, and then disembark again into the depths. Once tied up with the other vessels, Gimbal and I were taken to a private briefing, led by a man who clearly couldn't even fit into a diving suit if his life depended on it. No, he was clearly a topside leader. He sat us both down and, after having us sign over half a dozen non-disclosure agreements to make sure that we wouldn't blab to any reporters before they could announce their findings themselves, you could tell they had been fucked over before more than once by that problem. He showed us the map created by the sonar. Both of us stared in almost utter shock at what we saw. They were definitely ruins, alright. They lay in many patterns, the innermost almost circular in pattern, with outcroppings leading off in a straight direction. That was the biggest giveaway. Nature does not do straight lines. He also pointed out the battleship wreck lying just off to the side, which David focused on, but I was too enthralled by what I saw to care. I studied every inch of the sonar image of those ruins, mentally mapping them into my mind, deducing where the best place to start my sweep would be. My mind was racing with endless possibilities as well. How old would they have to be to remain undiscovered for so long? Certainly, I could understand why nobody had ever found them. We've only explored about 5% of the ocean so far, and anything could be hidden in that remaining 95%. After we'd finished with our regular briefing, the man named Le Cassé warned us that a tropical storm was brewing about 8 miles to the west of us, and was heading in our direction. He told us that if it didn't alter its course, the topside ships would have to pull out to a safer location until it passed, which he said out here could take a couple of weeks. We'd also be out of radio contact with them as well, which meant that if any emergency arose beneath the waves, all we'd have would be the onboard doctor, her staff, and her equipment. We both told them that we understood, and we'd make sure to keep ourselves and our team as safe as we possibly could. After, we were both ushered from the ship onto the platform, where a 3-man submersible waited to take us down. Carrying only one duffel bag of clothing and personal belongings each, we squeezed into the tight interior, and the hatch was sealed. 2 safety divers swam around us, making final checks to be sure the submersible was ready for descent. One approached the small window in the front and flashed the OK sign to our pilot. I craned my neck to catch a final glimpse of the orange sunset disappearing in the horizon. And then, we slipped quietly below the waves and began our descent into the deep. There's a reason why the area of water we were hitting is dubbed the Midnight Zone. When you're down there, you're so far from the surface that no light can reach you. Aside from the artificial lights of the sub, or the occasional flashes made by deep-sea creatures, there is nothing around you but blackness. An impenetrable darkness that almost seemed to reach out with fast, unseen clawed hands to wrap around you. Like it wishes to suffocate you in its unending embrace. Even when you've dove in water this deep 100 times, you still get an eerie, almost primal sense of fear looking out past where the light cannot reach. Because you can't see what lurks just beyond the veil. I feel ashamed, like a child afraid of monsters under the bed or in the closet, by saying that I felt a huge sense of relief when I spotted the station appearing beneath us. The darkness shooed away by dozens of lights mounted on and around it. I could see the other divers in what had to be the new exosuits plodding around the outside of the base, setting up their final camera systems and setting down huge cases of equipment for the coming days and weeks of exploring and surveying. Our sub moved into position and hooked onto a hatch that would allow us to transfer from it into the base itself. After the water had been drained and the pressure equalized, the pilot unscrewed the hatch and opened it for us to climb through. He gave us a cheerful smile and pat on the back as we climbed through. "Have a good stay, lads," he called after us with an Irish accent. "I'll be seeing you in about 6 to 7 weeks. Be safe." We both thanked him, and he sealed the hatch again, disconnecting himself from the station, and slowly began his long ascent back up to the surface, leaving the both of us to marvel at what we had stepped into. It was clear that tens of millions, if not billions of dollars had been invested into designing that base. It had been placed directly between the two sites, and it was huge. Of course, it had to be to accommodate the number of people on our two teams, plus the 3 members of the medical staff. The entire structure had been made from a metal that could withstand the immense pressure pressing down on it from all sides. You could always hear the structure creak and groan as it won its endless battles with the water outside. Right away, we were met by the base's leader, a tall, lanky man with hair that stuck out like the spines of a sea urchin named Karl. He showed us to our cabins to drop off our gear, then escorted us to the main observation area and operations room located in the center of the base. There was a rather large dome window dominating the far wall, made out of extremely strong and durable plexiglass that allowed anyone in the room to look out at the work any divers in the immediate vicinity were doing, along with a bank of consoles on the opposite wall that showed the views of a half a dozen cameras mounted outside, and also ones that were mounted on the shoulders of the exosuits. I took a glance out of the window at the darkness, just out of range of the lights, and unwillingly shuddered, before shaking my head and turning back to Carruthers and Gimbal. "You're absolutely obsessed with the ocean, and have been almost as deep as this before," I chided myself. "You know better than most people what really lays in the gloom, so stop looking out there and letting your subconscious think up things that aren't there." Shaking the feeling from my mind, I focused in and listened to the men speak. He filled us in on what had been done so far. They had set up the perimeter around the base, and had also set up rope guides and light poles leading to both sides, but hadn't actually begun any surveying yet. They had been instructed to wait on our arrival to begin that stage of work. We were to rest up and meet our respective teams when they returned from outside. Tomorrow, we would both set out on our respective paths to begin our initial sweeps. We would each be in charge of 6 people, plus ourselves. He told us that everyone had been handpicked by the group's board members for their qualifications and merits, and that they could all handle themselves under intense pressure and time constraints. All they needed were natural leaders, and that was us. He first walked Dave through the info they had acquired on the battleship, and this time, I chose to listen out of sheer curiosity. He said that the ship had gone missing halfway through the war without a single trace. Their last report had been that they were about to be battered by a huge storm. But their last location was what baffled me. According to a few declassified military records they had been given by the Navy, when the last known position had been transmitted, it was all the way up near the Philippines, thousands of miles away from here. My mind raced with confusion, trying to use reason and logic to come to a sensible conclusion. How in the hell could they have been blown this far, of course? I could understand that they may have been blown a few hundred miles from where they should. But this far? Surely they would have noticed, if not with their equipment, then at least by maps, the stars and constellations. At least the fact there was no land for hundreds of miles. I couldn't make sense of it. The look on David's face told me he had the same thoughts. Carruthers explained that the US Navy had been notified immediately about the wreck, and they had asked personally for it to be photographed and documented for their records, along with ours. It was the primary reason for their financial aid. They wanted to know what had caused the wreck as much as we did. After he finished, he turned to me and only said very brief words about my expedition. There wasn't really much he could say anyways. They had little to no information about the ruins, other than what had been told on the surface and the sonar map. He did say that he wanted my team and I to move very slowly, as nobody could tell how old they really were. After we finished documenting and cataloging everything where it lay, then we could begin to see if we could lift any pieces and bring them back to base to study. I told him I understood and was ready when he deemed it was time to go. Inside though, I was bursting with the excitement and giddiness of a child discovering a Native American arrowhead in a stream. I couldn't wait to get out there and set foot in a place that nobody could have set in thousands of years. Even still, and though I mentally kicked myself for the ridiculous emotions I felt, I still refused to turn and look out in the abyss until I left the room and closed the hatch behind me. That evening, we met everyone at dinner in the gallery. My team was comprised of 4 men and 2 women: King, Elton, Figueroa, Brockman, Notting, and Carpenter. All of them were very experienced deep-sea divers. King, Brockman, and Notting were commercial salvage divers. All 3 had worked together for over 10 years, and you could easily tell that there was a distinct camaraderie between the 3 of them. Alton, Figueroa, and Carpenter were more along the lines of my work, Figueroa being a fellow marine biologist and oceanographer herself. And Alton and Carpenter had both graduated from Florida State with degrees in archaeology and oceanography, and were also both accredited surveyors. We soon all struck up a friendly vibe from various discussions about our shared love of the water, of 80s horror movies, and various other subjects. And within an hour we were laughing and joking like we had known each other for years. I could see David had also won over his team, though I had never gotten the time to properly learn any of their names. Now that I think about it, I never really learned any of their names, except for the few he ever said to me. We finished up eating, and then each retired to our respective quarters to rest up for the huge undertaking we'd all be facing tomorrow. And while we may have all gone to sleep, wishing the other pleasant dreams, with the exception of Figueroa being an apparent prankster, she snuck a rubber eel into Notting's bed, causing him to scream with an almost girly high-pitched scream which caused the rest of us to burst into uncontrollable laughter. I couldn't fall asleep peacefully. My mind seemed unable to shut down, and I tossed and turned, all the while feeling like there were fingers running themselves around inside my head. I glanced at one of the only personal possessions I had brought with me on the metal table beside the bed. A framed photograph of a smiling face, long, raven black hair, olive-colored skin, and emerald green eyes. A wide smile beaming out from an amazingly happy moment. Jackie. I turned away, unwilling to let my mind dive down that road, and I again felt that weird feeling like my skull was being massaged and probed around from within. For a moment, I swore I could almost hear a voice calling my name. Desmond? I shook it away, forcing myself to ignore it and fall asleep. Knowing what I do now though, if I'd realized what it had meant, I almost feel like I would have willingly walked to one of the diving airlocks and let the water rush in, drowning all of us. It would have been a death less horrific and painful than they ended up with. We awoke early the next day, all buzzing with anticipation at what we were about to do. My team and I were directed into the east airlock, and David and his were sent to the west. We all helped one another into our suits, and one of the medical team checked to make sure that they were all pressurized and sealed. They sealed the inner airlock door, and then flooded the room, pumping in seawater from outside. Once the room was completely filled, the outer hatch opened, and one by one, we slowly stepped out into the void. They have definitely done an amazing job on the exosuits. I can't deny that. They withstood the pressure outside perfectly, and were only as slow and cumbersome as the older models were. Like the previous model, they were equipped with shoulder-mounted lights, built-in heating units to keep the freezing cold of the outside water at bay, and a remote camera mounted on the side of the helmet for Carruthers and the rest of the people inside to watch. Also brought over were 2 thrusters mounted on top of our oxygen canisters that were controlled by joysticks and switches inside the suit. Walking around on the bottom of the ocean is almost exactly like walking on the surface of the moon. It's extremely slow going, so the thrusters aid you in moving around at a faster pace. We made sure our comms were working, both between each of us and the base itself. And after quickly instructing my team to stay safe, take their time working, keep in constant communication, and most importantly, to always work in teams of 2 and never wander off alone. We moved over to the equipment waiting for us near the beginning of the guide rope, picked it up, and then began our journey towards the ruins. The trip took us about 15 minutes to make. I was thankful for the guide rope and the lights that were spaced out about 30 feet or so along the line. After all, down here, all it takes is a split second, one wrong step into the darkness, and you can easily become lost and disoriented. There are stories stretching as far back as the beginning of deep-sea diving, of divers who became lost in the blackness, never to be seen again. I kept my gaze focused straight ahead of me, waiting to see my first glimpse at the reason I've been brought down here. And a few minutes later, I was rewarded for my vigilance.
Holy Jesus, Mother of God.
I heard Figueroa almost breathe. The sonar map hadn't been able to properly show the enormity of the site. The first stone pillars we saw, covered with ages of muck, algae and growth, rose high above our heads, almost to the point that the top of them were out of sight in the gloom provided by the final guide light. I knew there were more beyond it, just out of sight. But the thought that all of this covered an almost 3-mile wide stretch of ocean floor was almost incomprehensible on my brain. I was absolutely awestruck. My entire team was as well. But I shook my head to clear it. We had a job to do today, and only about 9 or 10 hours of oxygen to get it done. I turned back to my team and gave them their tasks of the day to perform. We would all work as a unit at first, setting up lights in and around the inner portion of the site to be able to properly see what we were doing. Once that was finished, Elton and Carpenter would begin their surveying duties, using a remotely operated variation of the site scan sonar system to give us a 3-dimensional map of the entire site, which would then be transmitted back to the base for us to look over at the end of the day. While they were doing that, the remaining 5 of us would divide into teams of 2 to do an initial sweep of the area, shooting video and taking still photographs for documentation. And we would do other tasks, including trying to date the ruins another day. With my instructions finished, along with a reminder to stay safe and alert, we began work. With the 7 of us working in tandem, we were able to set up the lights in less than 2.5 hours. And when we were finished, the darkness had been banished away. The ocean forced to reveal what it had kept hidden for so long. It was absolutely incredible. Somehow, even after all this time, despite the ocean currents and the crushing embrace, almost all of the pillars had remained intact, save for a select few that had crumbled into large piles of stone. Alton and Carpenter had already begun their survey. You could easily hear the whirring of the sensor as it wound its way through the ancient structures. Occasionally, you could see the bright yellow machine move slowly over your head as they joked with each other and made bets about who would win an upcoming baseball game they would miss. We had each teamed up and moved slowly down the rows of pillars towards the circular center. I had chosen to have Figueroa partner with me. Not only had she and I developed the best rapport of everyone, but in my professional opinion, she seemed the most centered, calm and astute of the rest of us. We each took a side and filmed and photographed pillars every couple of feet, getting closer to where it all converged, maintaining constant radio contact with each other and the other groups. About halfway down, she called me over to her side.
Windows, take a look at this,
she said, and proceeded to use the claw hand of her suit to rub away the muck as gently as possible. For a second, I couldn't distinguish a damn thing, but then realized what she had spotted. There were images carved deeply into the stone. Some were pictures, and others were, I could only assume, hieroglyphs or an ancient language I couldn't read. I didn't need to though. The carved pictures were sufficient enough to explain themselves. Depicted on the small portion of exposed stone that I could see was what I can only describe as something truly monstrous. The creature was gargantuan in size, with the head of a wolf eel, one gigantic black eye staring directly at the viewer, and an almost humanoid body covered in what appeared to be black scales. It reached towards the surface with webbed, clawed hands for what looked like a tribal boat, its occupants cowering in fear at their sealed fate. Around its torso swam smaller creatures, what had to be underlings of the monstrosity. They too appeared to be humanoid in shape, but with the heads of viperfish atop their shoulders. Their huge, razor-sharp maws poised open to catch the unfortunate victims that managed to avoid death from their leader. I scraped away algae from the carving underneath and shuddered softly at the next image. The huge creature had dragged the entire ship down to the bottom of the ocean and was slowly torturing its drowning victims. Limbs had been torn off, and a clear expression of malicious glee adorned its inhuman features. Still others being torn to shreds by the smaller monsters. The carving was so detailed that I could see each individual expression of horror and pain eternally frozen on each person's face.
My God,
I heard Figueroa say next to me. I shook my head.
I'm as much of a scientific man as you can be, Lisa. But that...
I closed my eyes. The images burned into the back of my eyelids.
That is the furthest thing from God you could possibly get.
I opened my eyes again, raised my camera, and snapped off a few shots of the carvings, then turned away, an almost desperate need to get away from whatever ancient civilization had conjured up that beast overwhelming me.
Come on, let's get to the center and finish up today's work.
The circular center was absolutely massive. We estimated it to be almost half a mile across from the end of one row of pillars to the beginning of another on the far side. Here and there, we could see some smaller formations rising up to about chest height at varying distances. But, for the most part, it was flat, save for an odd spiral that had been carved into the smooth stone deep enough that the outline could still be seen. When you dropped down onto it, you could feel the dips, even through the ages of mud and muck that had accumulated over it. We all moved out to a distance of about 5 feet from one another, and as a team, slowly moved across to the other side. We were about halfway across when I heard Nodding let out a shout of surprise, followed by curses.
Everyone stop.
I called.
Nodding, you alright? Yeah, I'm fine,
was the muttered reply I received. I needed more information though. When you're working in deep water, one small mistake can cost a diver's life.
What happened?
I pressed. After a few seconds of silence, he answered.
A goddamn gulper eel suddenly appeared out of nowhere, coming straight for my face, caught me off guard, and I stumbled back into a rock formation. Nothing's damaged on my suit. I just finished checking.
I let out a sigh of relief as the rest of the group burst into laughter.
What? Were you afraid that you were gonna be swallowed whole?
Brockman said in a sing-song voice, trying to lighten the mood. Everyone laughed harder, myself and even Nodding joining in. It helped loosen the sudden burst of tension that had fallen over us for that split second after all. Even from 15 feet away, I could see the sheepish expression he wore through his faceplate.
I just got startled to hell and back, that was all,
he said in return. He sighed.
and I'm sorry. But when I backed into that formation, I knocked it over.
I thrust it around the others to inspect the damage. He was right. The small pillar had indeed been knocked over. It lay on its side, a small shroud of muck settling around it. It looked to be in one piece, however.
It's okay, nothing. It didn't break at all. It just fell on its side. You're safe from being chewed out by me or Carruthers.
He let out a relieved sigh, and then looked down at the gauges lining the inside of his suit.
Thank Christ. Well, we got 2 hours of oxygen remaining, boss. You want to finish up surveying this area and head back to base?
I didn't answer him right away, however. I was staring down at where the pillar had clearly been knocked out from. There was a slot there, a rectangular opening about 3 or 4 feet across. But it didn't seem to only go down a few inches or even a few feet. The blackness in that space seemed greater, almost as if there was a space much larger and deeper beneath it. I felt the same odd sensation in my head again. This time, a little stronger. And for a split second, I was overcome with a desire to peer into the slot, to even swim into it. It was almost as if something had hooked itself into my brain and was trying to reel me in. I snapped out of my moment by Brockman calling my name.
Windows?
She asked, tentatively. I looked up at everyone. They all wore puzzled, confused expression on their faces as they stared at me. Shaking away the last tendrils of my insane thought, I pulled myself together.
Yeah, you're right, nothing. Let's finish up this area and be done for the day.
The next 3 weeks proceeded without incident for my own team, as well as David's. We both made very good progress on our respective sites, cataloging and documenting extensively. The feeling that I had during that first dive hadn't returned since, and I felt more like myself, more eager to learn all that we could about the ruins. The surface team had contacted us 2 days ago and had informed us that the storm was almost on top of us, so they would have to pull back until the storm either passed by or blew itself out. They did, however, authorize us to bring back a few pieces of the site to further study, and we had very selectively chosen 3 smaller pieces, using commercial lift packs to float them back to the base. Once inside, they had been brought to the lab for us to clean up and study. There had been more carvings depicting the same monster I'd seen on the carving I'd examined the first time, along with what we know now sure had to be a very ancient language. Using specialized scanning equipment, we had put it into a computer and had set it to attempt to translate to English. So far, it had been running for almost 3 days with no success. We headed back in the meantime to document the outer edges of the site, one of what we assumed to be our final initial passes. We had again divided up into teams of 2 and had fanned out over a distance of about 100 feet from the next team. This time around, I'd paired up with Carpenter, who had volunteered to help me photograph and film the end of one particular row of pillars. We were about halfway done with our job when I noticed the glint of something red and metallic reflecting off the glow of the nearest light. I turned and felt my jaw drop open. What in the absolute fuck? I was staring at a tricycle, a goddamn red children's tricycle, sitting perfectly upright on the bottom, not even 20 feet from me. Confusion filled my mind. How in the hell did that get down here? I narrowed my eyes and tried to think of a logical explanation. It could have fallen off someone's boat as it passed over the area. But there were 2 things that just seemed wrong to me. If it had fallen off someone's boat, it had to have been very freaking soon. It still had all of its paint on it, and there was absolutely no sign of rust. Not to mention that there was even a tiny bit of algae covering it. But more unsettling than that was the creeping sensation I felt. That tricycle, I couldn't put my finger on it. But it looked familiar. Almost as if I'd seen it somewhere before. Trying to shake off the odd feeling, I turned and called the carpenters back.
Hey Sean, would you fucking look at this? I just found an honest-to-God tricycle down here on the...
I trailed off as I turned back. It was gone. It had vanished into thin air. Or in this case, thin water. I blinked a couple of times, trying to rationalize with my own mind. What the... I shook my head hard, then looked down at my gauges, suddenly concerned with my own safety. Am I developing NN? Nitrogen narcosis is irreversible, but at these depths, a very dangerous alteration in consciousness caused by the anesthetic effect of certain gases at high pressures, which comes with a variety of symptoms, one of which includes auditory and visual hallucinations. To combat this, we were using a mixture of helium and oxygen in our air supply. But at these previously unventured depths with diving suits, I wondered if the mixture wasn't potent enough to ward off the onset.
You say something, boss?
I heard Carpenter Karl behind me, still trying to come to a conclusion in my own mind. I decided not to tell him what I'd seen. Not yet anyways.
Nothing, man.
I called back. For another minute or so, I gazed out into the darkness, trying to piece together jigsaw puzzles in my mind to figure out if we should hit back or not, just in case my assumptions were correct. I decided it's better to be safe than sorry.
Hey Sean, let's round up the others and head back to base. Something's not right here.
He didn't answer me. I turned, my worry giving way to a small twinge of annoyance.
Did you hear me, man?
Carpenter was gone. There was absolutely no trace that he'd ever been there, except for his bag of gear, which lay untouched where he had put it down. What the shit? I looked down the row of columns to see if I could see the orange-yellowish outline of his suit or the beam of his shoulder lights. Nothing. Where the hell did he go? He couldn't have slipped away that quietly. The thrusters make too much sound to do so. And unless it's someone master running away underwater in an 800-pound diving suit, he couldn't have disappeared on foot. Confusion gave way to the first tendrils of worry. I looked up at the nearest team to me, which were Figueroa and Brockman.
Hey, guys?
I called out in a voice that shook a little.
Did either of you see Carpenter pass by you?
They both looked over in confusion at me.
No, isn't he with you?
I didn't reply. Worry had become crept up by the first real tendrils of fear. I tried to keep my mind in check. I had to control myself. All of my team were counting on me to get them back safely. But in my mind, I couldn't help it. My memory shot back to a painting I'd purchased from my house about 3 years ago. A painting of a deep-sea diver in an old-school suit, light emanating from his helmet, as dozens of huge tentacles appeared behind him out of the gloom, ready to snatch him in an eternal embrace and drag him backwards to a watery grave. I spun around to face the darkness that I turned my back to, almost half expecting to see that very sight before me. But there was nothing there. Just blackness. By this time, I could hear the rest of my team churning up a frenzy over the comms. They had all heard me and were now calling out, trying to get Carpenter to reply to them, but to no avail. Carruthers was also trying to cut through the barrage of voices, trying to understand what was going on. Sheer panic and chaos had suddenly come crashing down on all of us. Pulling myself together, I summoned all of the emotional strength I could muster.
Shut up!
I yelled, as loud as I could into my mic. The jumble of voices ceased immediately. Quickly, I relayed to Carruthers what had happened, and asked them what the best course of action would be to take, with the knowledge that we only had about an hour and a quarter of air remaining. He was quiet for a moment, and then gave the order for us to search for a missing teammate for 15 minutes. No longer. Then get our asses back to the base, on the double.
Copy that.
I told him, and then told the rest of my team to gather up in my position. As one, we made our way through the ruins for the next 15 minutes, calling out over the comms, trying to get a response from Carpenter. But we found no trace of him at all. It was as if he'd been wiped from existence. With a vice gripping my heart and an unshakable feeling of dread coursing through me, I gave the order at 15 minutes for the rest of us to head back and stay close to each other. As we began our way back along the guideline, I swear that it felt like the darkness held at bay around us by the lights seemed to creep just a little bit closer, as if testing to see if it could reach us. Okay, so before I transcribe these final few pages, I need to say that this will be my very last post about the buoy and the pages themselves. I didn't expect anyone to realize what I was up to so quickly. But I was woken this morning by a knock at my door. When I answered it, I was met by one of the men who had been at the dock the day the buoy was taken by the Navy. He stated he had only come to ask a few follow-up questions, such as what our location was when we caught it in our nets, what the tides were like, and so on. I knew it was a bunch of bullshit, as it was information he could have gotten from my captain. He knew I knew it as well. That's when he not so subtly began threatening me, speaking about prison time, and worse, for leaking, as he put it, confidential documents before leaving. I'm currently packing my suitcase and leaving a message for my real estate agent to ask her to list my house for sale, along with one to my captain, telling him I won't be showing up anymore. I'm not sticking around, and as soon as I post this, I'm going to just get into my truck and drive. I'm going to disappear, and I'm going to stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere and burn the copies of the pages I have. Besides, I don't think I can wake up and look out at the ocean anymore. Here are the final pages. When we got back to base, we found even more chaos than we'd left. As we exited the airlock, Figueroa and King supported Brockman, who was now hysterically crying. I heard confused and angry shouting coming from the operations room. Instructing Brockman be brought to the medical bay to have her checked out, I removed myself from my team and headed towards the half-open hatch to see what the commotion was about. When I pushed the door open, I saw David standing inches from Carruthers' face. His face a mask of panic and rage. "What the hell is going on out there?" he almost screamed. I hurried to get in between the two of them in case my old friend ended up losing his temper enough to physically assault our commander. Pushing them apart, I turned my head to look at the both of them. "Whoa, whoa, what in the name of God is going on?" David looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw something I never had before, and it made me feel uneasy. There was a mixture of pure animalistic fear and defensive anger there. He began to shout again, but I grabbed him by his shoulders. "Calm yourself, Dave. Yelling isn't going to help anything right now. Take a deep breath and tell me what happened." He bent almost in half for a moment, trying to suck in deep breaths of air before standing up and telling me what had happened. 3 of the 6 members of his team were gone. They had been exploring the wreck and had discovered a massive fissure in its hull, almost as if it had steamed headlong into a reef. They were documenting the apparent cause of its sinking, when a strong rush of water had caught him and 3 others in his team, picking them up off the ocean floor and almost flinging them over a dozen yards from where they had been. The sea floor had also been kicked up, making visibility difficult to see. When they'd been able to make it back to the side of the wreck, the other three were just gone. There was no trace of them at all. Almost exactly what had happened with Carpenter. I turned to Carruthers and asked him if there was anything at all about the two sides that he knew that we didn't. He insisted that he had no knowledge he was withholding from us. I felt too emotionally drained to try and push the issue, so I turned to my colleagues and, in as calm of a voice, told them there was no use in fighting that didn't use up unnecessary energy, and we needed to keep our hits level. If not for our own sake, then for the rest of us. He looked at me hard for a long moment, and then nodded, before turning and heading back through the hatch. With the situation diffused, I turned back to Carruthers. Has the storm above us blown out or passed yet? Do we have any contact at all with the surface? He rubbed his hands over his eyes. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 20 minutes. No, he said wearily. The storm was still directly over our heads, and even though he'd tried the emergency long-wave radio, he'd received no response. Until it passed, we were completely cut off. I rubbed my own eyes, and then told them that until we could re-establish communication with the surface teams, it'd be safer if no one else went outside. He agreed, then turned and slumped into his chair, his body sagging with the weight that had now fallen on his shoulders. I left him alone, glancing back at his back. Despite my own grief and fear, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for the man. He would be the one who bore the brunt of the blame for this, since he was the commanding officer on the station. I shook my head and exited, closing the hatch behind me, and hurried back to check on Brockman. Thankfully, she had only suffered a minor emotional breakdown and had been given a light sedative to help her sleep. The rest of the teams were instructed to go and get some rest, and one by one, they filed out of the med bay, their expressions all a clear mix of anxiety and fear. Letting them go, I decided it would be best if I spoke to the head doctor about what I'd seen out there. Pulling her aside, I described in detail the moments leading up to Carpenter's disappearance, along with the thoughts I'd been having. She listened intently, and then commended me for my rational thinking. She did agree that I could have been affected by an early onset of nitrogen narcosis, and took 2 blood samples to check and see if our hypotheses were correct. As I left, she also informed me that the computer in the research lab had beeped once, indicating a part-way translation success. I thanked her and then headed to the lab to check before resting myself. Entering the dimly lit room, I crossed to the computer and shook the mouse to bring it out of hibernation mode. The screen came to life and glowed brightly. The one word it had deciphered proclaimed in big black letters: "Away." As I turned to leave, a voice from the other side of the lab made me nearly jump out of my skin. "Desmond?" Whirling to face whoever had said my name, I found Figueroa sitting at the examination table, one of the carvings lying in front of her. "Good God, Lisa. Give me a heart attack, why don't you?" I said, leaning against the wall to study myself. She gave me a small, strained smile. "Sorry, I thought you'd seen me." I held up a hand in the universal sign for, "It's okay." "What are you doing still up? You should be trying to get some rest, like the others." She motioned for me to join her at the table, and I walked over. "My mind is racing too much to try and sleep. At least yet," she said, and then gestured to the carving. "Have a look at the depictions on this." With a quick glance at her, I pulled on a pair of sterile gloves and gently pulled it towards me. "Is this the carving they're trying to translate?" I asked. "No, not this one," she replied. "That's over there." She pointed to the scanning machine behind the computer, where a large black cylindrical machine whirred softly. She continued. Remember the giant monster and its underlings that we've seen depicted on many of the other carvings we've seen? Well, if you look here, she pointed to a section which showed what appeared to be them in combat with other creatures. It appears they were locked into a sort of underwater siege with the beings here. She finished, and I looked closer. I could see the giant eel-headed creature looming behind his underlings, pointing with one of his clawed hands like a general commanding his troops. On the other side were what appeared to be creatures that, as close as you could come to describing them, were mermaids. They were humanoid in shape, with more human-like features than their adversaries, but still contained fish-like features. Large fish-like eyes and mouths containing sharp teeth were the biggest giveaways. Behind them stood what had to be their leader, who was equal in stature with the eel monster. The biggest difference between him and his soldiers was the fact that a giant pair of tusks protruded from his mouth, and a single eye dominated his upper face. I looked up at Figueroa. "So, do you know who won this battle?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but if you look here," she pointed to a symbol similar to the inner spiral of a nautilus shell, seemingly tattooed on the tusked leader's chest. "I've seen this symbol on many of the ruins we've studied. It suggests that the ruins are theirs, or at least the people who worship them. Not theirs." She gestured at the eel creature. I ran my fingers over the carving, taking it all in. Interesting. We'll have to cross-reference it against any other known ancient civilization of the area to see if there's any bleeding over of their myths. I stood up to leave, but she grabbed my wrist gently. "That's not all," she said softly, before rotating the ruin over to reveal the other side. After a second of staring at it, my eyes grew wide. I jerked my head to look up at her. She simply nodded. My voice shook uncharacteristically. How is that possible?" Depicted on this side of the ruin, which almost appeared to be in much better, much newer condition, was a carving of what appeared to be the eel-headed monster pulling down a battleship while the tusk creature attempted to stop him. A World War II battleship. And, more to the point, it looked almost exactly like the wreck which David's team had found and had been exploring. Both leaders' underlings swarmed under and around them, the viperfish-headed ones attempting to dismember and devour the drowning sailors, while the mermaid-looking creatures attempted to save them. "Lisa, how is that even possible?" I asked again, almost in a whisper. She shook her head gently. "I don't know," she said softly. I held her gaze for a moment, then pulled off my gloves and stepped around the table. I took a deep breath, then spoke over my shoulder. "You should try and get some sleep." "I will," she said. "Soon." As I went to exit, I turned and asked her one final question. If that battle depicted is the newest carving in terms of age, then what does that mean? What happened to what appeared to be, for all intents and purposes, the side of good in these battles? Figueroa looked up from the ruin, answering me simply, but seriously. "Maybe they lost." Trying to ignore the growing feeling of insects crawling under my skin, I shook my head and left the lab for my cabin. I wouldn't be able to fully understand the message until the rest had been deciphered and translated. And until then, all I could do was chase shadows and scare myself. The same went for the carvings. As I entered my cabin, a flash of thought entered my mind. I remembered why that tricycle I'd sworn I'd seen had looked so familiar. It was almost identical to one that I had played around on in my parents' front yard as a kid. If I didn't know any better... No, knock it off, Desmond. There is no way it could have been the same. Things just don't pop out of your mind into the real world. Lying down on my bunk, I glanced again at the photo on the table. I reached out and caressed the cheek delicately. Jackie, please, wherever you are, babe, help me get through this, I whispered, then rolled over and pulled the thin sheet up to my shoulders, forcing my eyes closed, and soon fell into a restless sleep. A sleep perturbed by nightmares of Carpenter and the 3 members of David's team, screaming in the dark void as they were being skinned, torn apart, and eaten alive. Desmond. I rolled over in my bunk, fighting back the waking world. I grunted. Desmond? Darling? I pulled myself partway out of my slumber. Yeah, Jackie. What is it, babe? I mumbled, trying to get comfortable. We really needed a new bed in the house. This one was getting old and uncomfortable. Almost like there was metal underneath. I shut up straight, as though I'd been zapped with electricity, reality slamming into my brain and reminding me that I wasn't sleeping in my own bed at home in Coos Bay. I was almost a mile underneath the ocean, and Jackie wasn't anywhere near here. Jackie wasn't anywhere anymore. Not for 4 years. My breath came in huge, ragged gasps, cold sweat coursing down my body. You couldn't have heard that. It was part of your dream. You didn't actually hear her voice. That's what I kept repeating to myself over and over, willing the mantra to sink in. After a minute or so, I started to believe it and forced myself to lie back down. I turned back onto my side and began to close my eyes again when a loud, piercing scream suddenly rang out from the corridor. My mind reacted faster than my body could relay information, and I flew out of bed, promptly tripping over the sheet that had entangled itself around my legs. Rubbing my head where it had hit the grated floor, I stumbled back to my feet and raced out into the hall. Everyone's hatches were open, and frightened faces all peered around the edges. All except one. I rushed from my cabin towards Brockman's half-closed door and yanked it open. She lay there quivering, backed against the corner of her bed that was nearest the wall, her knees pulled up against her chest and her head tucked in them. I slowly crossed the small room and knelt on the bed in front of her. Brockman? She didn't respond. I tried using her first name. Tish, what happened? A muffled reply came from between her knees, which I couldn't hear. What? She raised her head slightly, not enough to reach my eyes. And this time, I heard her clear enough to understand, though her voice was muffled, still muffled slightly from the mucus freely flowing from her nose and over her lips, giving it almost a burble. I heard him. A shiver passed down my spine, though I couldn't understand why. Heard him? Who's him? Who did you hear? I asked gently. She raised her head completely, now meeting my gaze. She wore a look of almost petrified horror in place of the usual relaxed and happy expression I had grown to know and care about. Her face trembled furiously. I heard Sean calling out my name in the dark, asking why we'd left him there. He said... She choked back a sob and finished her sentence, her voice rising into a shrill scream. He said what happened to him was nothing compared to the end we would receive, that we'd all end up dying here in this base, screaming in the dark. I stared in shock and sadness at her. She was completely going over into the deep end. Losing her close friend had absolutely shattered her psyche, and she was beginning to hear things. I made my voice as soothing as I possibly could, reaching out and gently putting a hand on her shoulder. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Tish, it's okay. Nobody else is going to die down here. We're all going to make it back up top as soon as the storm clears. You didn't hear Sean. You're just mentally scarred from losing your friend. It'll be alright. She pulled her head up again to look at me, and I pulled back sharply at what I saw. The look on her face had changed. She no longer looked terrified. It had been replaced by a look of almost complete insanity. A smile crossed slowly over her lips. But this wasn't a happy smile. In fact, it made her look almost demonic in the low light. A small giggle escaped her, and her eyes burned holes into mine. That's not all he said to me. He also said that you have a fate worse than any of ours. It's taken special interest in you, because you're so damn smart and have such inner strength. She giggled again. It's going to take its time with you, Desmond. It's going to leave you for last. And you'll scream longer and worse than we ever will. And with that, she collapsed into unconsciousness. I slowly stood up and moved away from the figure on the bed. I knew that she hadn't been right when she said those things, that her cracking mind had simply brought them up from a very dark place. And yet, I couldn't help but feel unrelenting chills pass through my body. Her words had wound their way past my rational thinking and into the deepest corners of my own mind. And they were repeating themselves there, making me feel as though I were continuously being doused in ice water. I backed out of the cabin, allowing the medical team to enter and take her to the med bay to keep an eye on. Turning to the rest, I found them all staring at me. Some of their faces confused. On others, fear. Figueroa locked eyes with me as I scanned the group. I nodded at her and tried to keep the shake out of my voice. It's over with, guys. Let's try and get a few more hours of sleep. We need it. And with that, I walked back into my cabin, Brockman's words echoing in my brain. You'll scream longer and worse than we ever will. Trying to push it away, I laid back down again and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall back asleep and trying to ignore the voice of my dead wife calling to me from somewhere in my subconscious. Desmond? Nope. Not listening. You're not there. You're only in my head. Desmond? Still not listening. Desmond! I shut up in my bunk. That voice had been one of the team. It came again. Desmond, wake up and get in here! I stumbled to my feet, careful to make sure I didn't trip again on the sheets, and ran barefoot into the corridor. I recognized the voice now. It belonged to King, and it was coming from the operation room. Flying through the open hatch, I turned and saw him staring at the bank of monitors that showed the external views from the cameras mounted on the exterior of the base. Joining him, my breath was wrenched from me like a knife that had pierced my lungs. On the screen from the camera facing out from above the eastern airlock was an image we couldn't possibly be seeing. Tell me you're seeing that too, Windows, King said in a voice that shook slightly. I could only nod in response. There was a diver out there. Whoever it was standing with their back towards the camera, but we could tell it was one of our dive suits. I asked them to zoom in to the lower part of the thruster assembly. Each individual diver had their name stamped on their respective suits to avoid confusion. We'd be able to tell who it was. As the letters came into focus, both of us let out our breath in a huge gasp. That's Carpenter, King whispered after a moment. I kept on blinking my eyes, willing for the letters to change, but they remained the same. "That's fucking impossible," I said. "He would have run out of air more than 10 hours ago. There is absolutely no way he could possibly still be alive." He looked over at me, his eyes showing that he was trying to make sense of what was before us, but unable to. "Then how in the hell did his body float all the way back here?" I couldn't think of anything to respond with. Even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't. Carruthers, Figueroa and Nodding must have heard King's shouts, because they entered the room, Figueroa rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked sleepily. "Yeah," Nodding echoed. "What's up?" His eyes grew wide as he saw what we were looking at on the screen. "Carpenter?" he breathed out. Carruthers moved in between me and King quickly. "He couldn't have survived this long out there, could he?" he asked me quietly. I gave my head an almost imperceptible shake, just enough for him to notice. He stared again at the monitor, then turned back to the other two. "Guys, I'm sorry to have to be the one to say this, but..." He was cut off by Figueroa, who was pointing towards the screen we were now facing away from. "Oh my god, he's alive!" she yelped. We all swiveled back toward the screen, but the suit was in the same place as it had been when I'd first seen it. I turned back. "Lisa," I began gently, but Nodding cut in. "No, she's right. I saw the suit's arm lift up as well. He's alive." Carruthers, King and I tried to quiet the two of them. We could hear the rest of the group coming down the corridor. But suddenly, Nodding was a blur of motion, running towards the hatch and beyond. The airlock. "He's alive, damn it!" he screamed. "I'm not leaving him to die out there." Carruthers tried running after him. Nodding was trying to pull the hatch closed when he grabbed the handle. "Evan, don't be fucking stupid," he yelled. The hatch reversed direction quickly, smashing him in the head and knocking him on his back. Figueroa and I rushed to check on him. Blood was sipping from a newly formed gash just below his hairline. One of the doctors poked their head through the door. "What the hell is going on?" he asked incredulously. I snapped my head up from the half-conscious man. "For God's sake, stop him!" I screamed. Everybody turned to look away, and I heard the airlock door close and seal itself from the inside. I leapt up, leaving Carruthers to be held by Figueroa, and ran to the airlock door. Looking through the small porthole, I saw that Nodding had already got into his suit and sealed it. I pounded on the metal hatch. "Carpenter's fucking dead, you idiot!" But he either didn't hear my yell through the thick door, or simply ignored me. I saw him reach out with one clawed hand and smack the manual activation switch on the wall. The sound of the hatch filling with water filled my ears, and I screamed the same sentence I had already as the water rose over the porthole, begging that it would knock some sense into him. But it didn't. He reached down, turned the hatch with both claws, and then thrust it out of the airlock. I turned and ran back into the now crowded observation room, almost smashing into the monitors as I frantically searched the screens for the one that was linked to his suit-mounted camera. Finally, I found it in the lower right-hand corner. He was on the bottom now, using short thrusts to close the distance between him and the suit. I searched for the button to establish comms with his suit and stabbed it when I found it. Gripping the microphone tightly, I tried to speak in as calm of a voice as I could muster. "Evan, please, listen to me. Please, come back into the airlock."
"No, Desmond. He's alive,"
he replied defiantly in a small burst of static. "Evan, please, listen to common sense. Carpenter has been out there for over 14 hours. He only had enough air for 8. He can't possibly be alive. Please, I'm begging you. You don't want to see what's in there." But he ignored me. I heard him calling out over the open comm channel.
"Hey, Sean? Buddy?"
he called out. The still form, less than 8 feet in front of him, didn't reply.
Sean, buddy, thank God you made it back.
He pressed on.
I'm sorry we left you out there, man, but we couldn't find you. Please, turn around and come back inside with me. We'll help you feel better.
Still nothing but silence. But nodding suddenly continued on, as though he'd received an answer.
Why can't you turn around, man?
My brow furrowed in confusion, and I felt the same shiver that had passed through me when Brockman had made her insane declaration return. I glanced away from the screen and was greeted by the same look of uneasiness in the rest of them. I was brought back to the screen when I heard him speak again.
Why didn't I think before that you wouldn't be almost completely frozen by now? Of course, I'll help you turn around and pull you back inside.
He was now directly behind the suit, and I saw him reach out a claw to hook onto its arm tether. In that moment, I also noticed something else. Something that turned my blood to ice and almost completely tore away the sanity from my mind. A pale, webbed, clawed hand gently holding onto the side of the suit, just below the waist, as if keeping it in place. I snatched for the microphone to scream for nodding not to touch the suit, but it was already too late. He had gripped the tether and slowly began to turn it towards him, just before the front of the suit came into view. His screen cut off into static. A split second later, so did all the cameras facing the eastern side of the base. For a few moments, there was absolute silence in the room as we stared at the static-filled screens. It was shattered by the sound that almost leapt out of the speakers. Nodding had begun to scream. The same high-pitched, almost girly scream that he had made when he discovered the rubber eel Figueroa had put into his bed. Only this time, there was nothing funny about this scream at all. It never wavered at all. He never drew in a breath to continue screaming. It was simply one long, unending scream. One filled with more horror and pain than I'd ever heard anyone filled with before. It was so loud that it almost drowned out anything that was happening in the background. Almost. There was another sound that was barely audible underneath that almost inhuman wail, and it rooted me to the spot and drained all the blood from my face. It was the sound of something tearing apart his suit. For a split second, it was replaced by the sound of flesh tearing from bone, and then the sound of ocean rushing into his suit overwhelmed it. Nodding screams became muffled through the water for another moment, and then abruptly cut off. The salt water short-circuiting his comlink and filling the speakers with nothing but static. I stood rigid, the hairs all along my body standing up on end, my mind trying to make sense of the horror I had just witnessed. And I slowly turned back to the rest of the group. Their faces all held the same ashen, terrified expressions I knew my own face held. And then I heard the voice again. Her voice. Desmond? I closed my eyes and pressed my hands to my temples, attempting to force away the voice of the love of my life who had died 4 years ago in a boating accident. But this time, it didn't go away. Desmond? I opened my eyes as I felt the stinging sensation of hot tears forcing their way out of my tear ducts, and saw all of the others holding their hands to their heads. A few of them fell to their knees and curled up into tight balls. Mother? I heard King let out in a pained voice. At the same time, Carruthers, who had pulled himself back into consciousness, was leaning against the hatch. His face contorted into a face I had worn at my wife's funeral. Total anguish. Abigail, he whimpered. I'm so sorry that Daddy couldn't protect you. Please forgive me. The realization hit me like a freight train in that instant, connecting the soul-piercing pieces together in the one jigsaw puzzle I wish my mind wouldn't have been able to solve. The voice in my head, and the ones the others were hearing, the disappearance of Carpenter and the members of David's team, the storm overhead, the sunken battleship, not torn apart by a reef, but by something. The tricycle, my childhood tricycle, plucked out from my memories and shown to me. The carvings on the pillars of the monstrosities. Ruins that I now knew had never seen the surface in their entire existence. The single word that had been translated from the language on the stone we'd brought back. The piece that nothing had knocked over, in the almost endless darkness that had lain beneath it. A prison. It all fit. And it completely shattered my view of reality. Oh dear God, what have we done? At the same time, I heard a sound from out in the corridor, loud enough to be heard over the whispering voice that wouldn't go away. It was one that sent the same ice water sensation through my body and almost caused me to piss myself. The sound of the outer airlock door closing and something lumbering over towards the train cycle switch. Whatever spell had been keeping me in place shattered, and I flew past everyone into the corridor towards the inner hatch. Whatever had killed Nodding. You know exactly what killed Nodding, Desmond. Jackie's voice cooed inside my head. Its tone now shifted from the tone I'd lovingly remembered into one that was terrifyingly sinister. It had made its way into the airlock and was now trying to get inside the base. And we would all be dead if it was able to. I slammed into the hatch, staring through the porthole. And in that instant, all semblance of sanity fled my body from what I saw. My fractured mind was only able to take in two details. The hit. That awful hit that looked exactly like that of a viperfish, which turned to stare at me with one large bulbous eye, with the mouth that, even though it had no lips, seemed to turn from a threat display into a leering grin of what I could only describe as pure evil and malice. And, clutched in one webbed, clawed hand, oh dear Jesus, was Nodding's severed head. His face eternally frozen with the same look of horror and pain that had been bestowed upon the poor souls in the carvings. The last drops of blood dripping from the torn flaps of skin below his neck, where it had once connected with his body. I screamed as loud as I could for anyone to come help me keep the hatch closed. For a second, there was no reply at all, and I felt myself deflate inside. They were still in their own personal hell, haunted by the voices placed in their heads. No, pulled out of their heads, and didn't hear me. The water was almost completely drained from the airlock, and though I didn't glance through the porthole again, I knew it was coming closer to the hatch, readying to yank the wheel out of my grasp and come inside to begin its slaughter. I could hear its wheezing gasps. I screamed one last time, a scream more of defiance than help, when three shapes smashed into the hatch on the either side of me. Figueroa, Alton, and King had somehow snapped out of the trance and made their way over to me. "We have to seal the hatch," Figueroa screamed. "How?" "There's a manual lock on the door you need to press," Alton yelled. "Where?" I yelled back. "It's below your left knee," King interjected. I swung my gaze down as I felt the wheel being torn from my grasp as it began to spin and unlock. Spying the large black button set below in the door, I let go and let my own weight simply bring myself to my knees as I heard the loud click of the hatch unlocking and slammed the button with my fist as hard as I could, begging to a god I hadn't believed in since childhood that I hit it in time.
"Manual east airlock seal activated,"
a robotic voice said from somewhere behind me. The wheel spun itself back into the locked position, and I could hear the creature let out a loud hissing sound, though whether it was of pain or defeat, I couldn't tell. We all breathed a collective sigh of relief as reinforced bolts slammed into position. Feeling victorious, I stood up, not staring into the porthole again, but aiming my voice into it. "Fuck you, you stupid scaly son of a bitch!" I yelled at it. "Manual override trumps any strength your ancient ass may have. You lose, you seafood menu reject." For a second, the other three all stared at me, and then slowly began chuckling. A second later, I joined in, and we all slid down the door into sitting positions against it, laughing softly to each other. A soft voice choked away our laughter and echoed through the corridor. "You think you've won, Desmond?" We all looked up to see Brockman standing in the center of the junction, somehow awake and only wearing a patient gown. In her left hand was one of the doctor's scalpels. Blood dripped from the blade and the clenched fist that held it. I could only assume it belonged to the medical team. I pressed myself back against the metal. "You think just because you kept one of them out, you're safe?" She let out a loud, insane laugh, her eyes wide and darting around. "You haven't done shit. All you've done is delayed the inevitable. You can't win against these things. They are as old as the Earth itself. They will find a way inside, sooner or later. And then what Carpenter told me would happen will. And you will scream. You will all scream." The eyes locked onto mine. And in that instant, I realized that everything she had said earlier had been true. It had wanted her to know. To tell all of us. To tell me. "But you, Desmond? You will scream last and loudest. And it will be a torture and agony which you could never possibly imagine." She raised the arm that held the scalpel. "Good does not triumph over evil where evil lives. And God will not save you down here." Laughing maniacally, she raised the scalpel to her neck, and in one fluid motion, slit her throat from ear to ear. Figueroa's scream beside me stung my eardrums as her body fell to the ground, her mouth gurgling as she died. But it was not loud enough to mask the sound of the buzzer signaling that the west airlock had finished draining, and the hatch unlocking. That moment was over 2 hours ago, though it seems more like an eternity to me. The four of us ran, and I saw the others stumble out of the operations room in a daze. The spell on them now lifted. I knew it was only because they wanted them to see what was coming through that hatch. Wanted them to feel the same horror that Notting and Carpenter and the others must have felt in the last moments of their lives. Because they savor every drop of it. They wanted them conscious to witness their own deaths. I never looked back. I didn't want to hear it tear into the first of the people I'd come to call my friends, to see them torn apart slowly. I heard their screams though. A single one. Then silence for a time. Then another. All in almost the same way we'd heard Notting scream through the speakers. King and Alton had become separated from Figueroa and me. I don't know where they had gone, but we heard their screams about an hour later, one after the other. The two of us, the last two remaining, had locked ourselves in the research lab, cowering under the table with the computer that had finished decoding the warning that I already knew by now in my heart and soul. Stay away from here. Evil is imprisoned below. Death is what you shall find if you stay. Figueroa ran away half an hour ago. She had put her hands over her ears, no doubt being mentally tortured by the monster. Not the small ones, but the one that peers out of its newly unlocked prison. Its horrible face filled with malicious glee at what it is able to do once again. It must have become too much for her, because she finally wrenched herself free from my arms, ran to the closed hatch, and was gone. I know I should have been the brave one and gone after her, but I was just too afraid. I dashed across the room and resealed the door before attempting to barricade it with another table in the lab. Though I know that when those monsters choose to come for me, that will not stop them or slow their pursuit. I heard her scream 5 minutes ago. I know I am all that remains of the entire team, And that is why I am hastily scrawling this account on a few sheets of scrap paper I found on top of the desk I hid under. Because somebody needs to know the truth about what has happened down here. I hear them pressing against the walls of the lab now. I can hear their soft hissing cries of glee as they slowly inch closer to the hatch. But over all of that, I can hear their goddamn master whispering to me in my head. Whispering to me in the voice of the person I loved and cared for most in the whole world. It delights in telling me in that voice of all the things it is planning to do to me. Things that I cannot bear to write down. For I will lose the last 10 joules of sanity left in my body. Brockman was right. It did leave me until last. It let me hear the ends of all the others. Let each kill shatter a part of my soul. And now that it has almost completely broken me, it is sending its underlings for me. They will break into my temporary refuge. They will hurt me. They will bite and slash me until I am half dead. But they will not kill me. No. That honor is reserved for the master. The monster that is the source of old sailors' tales, of legends as far back as man has dwelt on this planet. They will drag my almost limbless body out of the airlock, forcing me into my suit to keep me from drowning, and then bring me back to those godforsaken ruins. To that hole, that broken lock, and down there where it awaits me. To make my death something that even the cosmos will take notice of. I am placing this account into the inner compartment of the emergency distress beacon hooked into the wall on the opposite side of the lab, and then sending it up to the surface. Please, I beg of you, one final time. Do not come down here looking for us. Stay away from this stretch of ocean at any costs. We have unleashed something that the creatures who locked it away tried to keep hidden from us. For our sake. Humanity's sake. This is a place that we were never meant to go. Nothing but death awaits you down here, in the void. Stay away.